always, from the heart of the city, and now on demand 24/7 on the CHFI website. This is the soundtrack to What We Save. And I'm Don Jackson, around the world on the internet. In the Hearst book, The Romantic Heart, was this by Raymond Carver. Suppose I say summer. Write the word hummingbird. Put it in an envelope. Take it down the hill to the box. When you open my letter, you will recall those days and how much, just how much, I love you. The words of Raymond Carver. What we save this hour with Lovers and Other Strangers. From iTunes and CHFI.com. Beyonce, Irreplaceable, and Elton John with your song. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Here's another excerpt from that same collection from the publishers of Victoria magazine, an excerpt from Swan's Way. And so, night after night, she would be taken home in Swan's carriage. And one night, after she had got down, and while he stood at the gate and murmured, "Till tomorrow, then," she turned impulsively from him, plucked a last lingering chrysanthemum in the tiny garden which flanked the pathway from the street to her house, and as he went back to his carriage, thrust it into his hand. He held it pressed to his lips during the drive home, and when in due course the flower withered, locked it away like something very precious in a secret drawer of his desk. Lovers and Other Strangers and What We Save. I'm Don Jackson from iTunes and CHFI.com. Roberta Flack, Killing Me Softly, and Roch Voisine, Am I Wrong? I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Susan Volchok wrote an article that appeared in the January 1986 issue of Glamour magazine. It has weathered the test of time. In it, she wrote, and I quote, "No matter how much you want to forget, there will come a day when you'll want to remember. On a shelf in my bedroom closet sits a bulging old cardboard file. Among other correspondence, it contains some 100 letters from Dee, my first true love. The letters found me over a period of years in a Ohio college, on a kibbutz in Israel, in hostels throughout Europe, and finally home in New York. They follow the long, uncertain progress of our romance far better than my memory alone could. I haven't been in touch with Dee for over 10 years now, and I can't recall the last time I reread his letters. But I've always been glad they are there, glad that some record remains of that passion. Those bundles of yellowing paper are particularly precious because they are nearly all that did survive my youthful, melodramatic predilection to destroy all the evidence at an affair's end. In those days, every failed romance found me afterward grimly determined to efface every last trace of the man. I became adept at the ritualistic roasting of letters over kitchen sink fires. Out to the incinerator went the clothes, a baggy sweater, a pair of gym shorts he left behind. Into the wastebasket, the trinkets brought back from trips, picture postcards taped to the refrigerator door. But my impassioned destruction of these pieces of my passionate past was more hurtful than helpful even at the time. For one thing, it painfully contradicted my own nature. I've always been a collector at heart, a storer-up of memories and mementos. I don't dwell in the past, but it is a place I like to visit. My appreciation of its importance should have halted my search and destroy missions, or at least warned me that I would live to regret them. Unquote. More shortly, with Lovers and Other Strangers, from iTunes and CHFI.com. Kelly Rowland with Unity, Dido's White Flag, and Sheryl Crow with Sting, always on your side. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Susan Volchok wrote this article that appeared in the January 1986 issue of Glamour magazine. She goes on to write, and again I quote, "Moreover, my frenzied efforts were doomed to exercises in futility, given the nature of lost love itself. It is practically written into the romantic tradition that we go on living amid the wreckage of romance, sifting through it for clues. How can we come to terms with what happened if we pretend it never did? A little pining is good for the soul. Being reminded can be sweet, if bittersweet. It is almost unnatural not to indulge in the pleasure of this kind of pain. And while no one wants to be a passive victim, it is important to be able to acknowledge, as I couldn't then, that pain doesn't always respond to doing. Out of control, I tried to seize control by radical means, as if torching a snapshot could touch the man who'd left me. But it didn't even bring the forgetfulness that destruction promises. I often felt worse after the temporary glow of the final flames. Not that that stopped me the next time, or the next time after that. It took years for me to realize that cutting myself off from my past was childishly self-punishing. And that is when the real consequences of my recklessness caught up with me. For no matter how much you imagine you want to forget, there comes a day when you want to remember everything. His smile, how much he loved you, the fact that you were loved by someone. Unquote. More shortly, with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. The Guess Who with These Eyes and Whitney Houston and I Will Always Love You. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Rilke, writing of one faded rose, said, "How many times have I seen you? In a perfumed jewel box, beside a lover's lock, or in a beloved book that one rereads alone." Susan Volchok continues, and again I quote, "I don't think I ever felt my loss so keenly as when I miraculously recovered a small part of it, a slide of D that I'd unknowingly spared along with his letters. It was like seeing a ghost, but now a dear, dear old ghost. How, I wondered, could I have tried to forbid myself so much as a backward glance at the image of a man I'd once loved so well? And what of all the others? Gone. No time for second thoughts, no second chances, and no one to blame but myself. The memorabilia of love are like pearls strung upon one of the strongest strands in a woman's life, each has its value, its significance. I am poorer for having discarded so many of those small treasures along the way. What is missing matters as much as what I managed to save. Learning that the hard way has only encouraged the collector in me. Unquote. Susan Volchok, in this Glamour magazine article from some time back, goes on to write, again I quote, "I've been living with the same man for 9 years and accumulating even more avidly the stuff of this last longest affair. Now I understand more about what it all means to me, or will mean. And if this romance should end, if I've learned something about the art of good endings, it's this. When it's over, do nothing. Nothing rash, that is. You may revile him now, but one spring, you may want to unbox those letters. Break out that poetry. Stop, if you must. Better to stomp on his photograph, shoes off, and slip it safely into a drawer with everything else against that later time." Unquote. The conclusion of Susan Volchok's Glamour magazine article shortly, with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. You can even send me an email at CHFI.com. That's Faith Hill and Cry. I'm Don Jackson with Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. The author of the article is Susan Volchok. It appeared in Glamour magazine some years back. She goes on to write in the conclusion of this article, and again I quote, "Wreaking havoc on personal history, vandalizing your own archives, seems to me one of the saddest, most senseless things anyone can do. It's hard enough to lose a love without losing something finally more sacred, your sense of the wholeness and richness of your life." Unquote. One final thought this hour from Nicholas Linnell. Leafing through a book, I found a pressed and faded rose, and no longer knew whose hand had picked it for me once. Lovers and Other Strangers from iTunes and CHFI.com. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.